The station lights flickered as if the city itself was holding its breath. Nova Gray woke to the sound of boots on concrete. Too close, too fast. She had learned to sleep with one eye open, curled against the warm vent near the east wall of Central Station. Her notebook pressed against her chest like a shield. Guards in dark uniforms were sweeping the platform, checking papers, checking faces, checking for people who did not exist on any screen. "Nameless stray," one of them muttered, nudging her shoulder with his boot. Nova sat up slowly, blinking against the light. She was used to being spoken about instead of spoken to. Behind the guard stood a man the whole city knew without needing an introduction. Alpha King Darius Vale, tall and composed, his coat still damp from the crisis meeting he had just left. Beside him stood a small boy, no older than 7, his hand tucked carefully into his father's. The boy had not said a word in 3 years. Doctors called it trauma. Elders called it weakness. His father called it a wound he had not yet learned how to heal. Then the boy looked at Nova. Something in his face changed, like a door opening after a long winter. He pulled his hand free before the guards could react. He ran, not away, toward her. Small arms wrapped around Nova's neck before she could even flinch, and the station seemed to freeze around them. Darius's voice cracked through the silence, sharp with fear. "Milo." The boy did not let go. Instead, after 3 years of silence, he whispered a single word into Nova's shoulder. "Mom." The word landed like a gunshot. Darius went still, his heart forgetting how to beat correctly. His mate, Milo's mother, had died 3 years ago in a fire that had taken more than just her life. This woman was a stranger, a homeless stranger with no papers, no history, no name that meant anything to the registry that ran his city. But the moment Milo's small hand touched Nova's skin, something else began to happen. The screens above the platform flickered, then turned white. An executive near the ticket booth looked down at his own badge and frowned, as if the name printed on it belonged to someone else. A guard reached for his rank insignia and could not remember what it stood for. Somewhere in the financial district, a noblewoman screamed because the pack bond in her mind had gone silent, as if it no longer knew who she was. Nova closed her eyes. She knew this feeling. She had felt fragments of it in her dreams for years, but never like this. Never all at once, never this loud. Darius grabbed her arm, his grip tight with panic and something rawer underneath. "What did you do to my son?" Nova looked at him, unafraid in a way that unsettled him more than any threat could have. "Your city is not losing its names because of me." Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "It is losing them because it survived too long by taking names from others." Behind them, the station lights buzzed and dimmed, as if the whole city had just remembered something it had spent years trying to forget. Nova had lived around Central Station for longer than she could clearly remember. She slept where the heating vents kept the cold from settling into her bones, and she kept a small circle of people who understood what it meant to be unseen by the system that ruled the city. Runaway wolves, undocumented children, omegas who had slipped through the cracks of pack registries that decided who counted as real. People called her the nameless girl, the gutter omega, the paperless wolf. None of it was true, not exactly. Nova had a name. She simply did not know if it was the one she was born with. What she did know was that she carried names that did not belong to her, names that came to her in dreams whenever a wolf was erased from the registry unfairly. Not wolves who changed their names on purpose. Not wolves who left with witnesses to see them go. Only the ones who were deleted, stripped, forgotten by systems built to decide who mattered. Her curse did not steal names. It kept the names the city had thrown away. She had learned the rules the hard the way most cursed things are learned, through loss. When Nova was young, her mother fell behind on housing debt owed to the pack. One day her mother had a name. The next day, the shelter said no such woman had ever lived there. The school said Nova had no listed guardian. The hospital said the family record was invalid. Even the pack bond, that quiet hum of belonging every wolf carried, stopped calling her mother's name. Nova was the only one left who remembered her mother singing a lullaby in the rain, soft and off-key, her hand resting against Nova's small back. But the name itself was gone, vanished, like it had never been spoken at all. The city did not kill my mother first. Nova had told herself this so many times it had become a kind of prayer. It made everyone forget she had been alive. That was the day Nova started writing names in a notebook, not because she knew how to save anyone, but because she was terrified that a name forgotten twice was a death that happened twice. Darius carried Milo back to the penthouse that night in silence, his mind replaying the word his son had spoken for the first time in 3 years. Mom. He did not sleep. Instead, once Milo had drifted off, Darius opened the small notebook his son carried everywhere, the one no one was allowed to touch while he was awake. Page after page held the same drawing, a woman with no face, standing in the rain. Beneath each drawing was a small symbol, repeated so many times it had worn a groove into the paper. Darius assumed it was grief given shape, a child's private language for a mother he could not have and could not forget. He did not know that the symbol was not invented at all. When Nova saw it days later, her whole body went cold. She had seen that exact mark before, not on paper, but in her dreams, burned into the edges of names that came to her broken and half destroyed. It was not a symbol Milo had created. It was the charred first letter of names lost in a registry fire, the same fire that had taken his mother. Nova said nothing at first. She did not trust Darius enough yet to hand him the truth, but she understood in that moment that Milo was not only mourning his mother. He was holding a fragment of every name that had burned alongside her, carrying a weight far too heavy for a 7-year-old to bear alone. Darius Vale ruled Vale City the way modern power actually worked, not with a throne, but with data. Pack registries decided who could see a doctor, who could enroll in the good schools, who could rent an apartment, who could walk past security without being stopped and questioned. Since Elena's death, Darius had convinced himself that the fire which killed his mate had been caused by chaos in the old records, by loopholes and unverified identities slipping through cracks that should have been sealed, so he sealed them. He gave his registrar, a precise and colorless man named Silas Vorn, the authority to build something called the Clean Name Initiative. On paper, it reduced fraud. It synced hospitals, schools, and security systems into one clean network. It made Vale City efficient, modern, safe. What it also did quietly and without ceremony was erase anyone who could not produce the correct documents. Darius had signed an order meant to sound responsible. A city cannot protect names it cannot verify. Silas had taken that single sentence and built an entire machine around it. Silas Vorn did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as necessary. Where others saw grieving families sleeping in shelters, Silas saw unverified risk, numbers that made the system unstable. He believed, with the calm certainty of a man who had never once doubted his own reasoning, that a name without proof was not identity at all. A name without verification is not identity. He told this to Darius plainly, the way one might describe a policy change instead of a person's erasure. It is noise. Lady Cressida Vale. Darius's mother and the last living voice of the old pack aristocracy agreed with him completely. To her, names were not rights. They were inheritance, something earned through bloodline and belonging, not something owed to every stray who wandered into the city's shadows. A name is an inheritance. She said it the way she said most things, with the absolute confidence of someone who had never had to fight to keep her own. Not every stray gets one. Silas saw the chaos spreading through the city, the forgotten names, the panicked nobles, as an opportunity rather than a warning. If he could convince Darius that Nova was the source of the crisis, he could push through something far more permanent, a law that would let him erase the unverified for good. Darius brought Nova to the registry tower that same night, not as a guest, but as a suspect. Milo refused to let go of her hand the entire elevator ride up, and no amount of coaxing from his father could change that. "Why does he call you that?" Darius's voice was rough with exhaustion and something closer to grief than anger. Nova met his eyes without flinching. "I am not his mother." She said it plainly, because it was true, and because she needed him to hear it before anything else was said. "I have never met your son before tonight." But standing this close to Milo, something else reached her, a fragment of melody threading through her mind, a lullaby sung in the rain. It was not her mother's voice. It belonged to someone else. Someone whose name had been burned and scattered, someone whose memory Milo had somehow been keeping safe in the only language he had left. Nova realized, with a chill that ran straight through her chest, that she was carrying a piece of Elena Vale. "She is not entirely gone," Nova said it carefully, watching the way Darius's whole body tensed at the words. Darius's fury came fast, the kind born from grief that has never been given anywhere safe to go. He accused her of exploiting his dead mate, of using his son's pain for whatever it was she wanted. Nova did not back down. "I do not bring back the dead." Her voice was steady, even as something warm and dangerous stirred low in her chest, a pull she recognized instantly and refused to name out loud. "I remember what your registry failed to bury cleanly." For one unguarded second, the bond between them flared, unmistakable, undeniable. Nova buried the feeling as quickly as it rose. A bond meant nothing if the man on the other end of it had the power to erase her from every system in the city with a single signature. The crisis did not stay contained to Central Station. Across Vale City, names began slipping away in waves, striking those who had spent their whole lives certain their place in the world could never be questioned. Executives stood frozen in boardrooms, unable to recall the names on the contracts they were meant to sign. Private school teachers called children by the wrong names, and the children cried, confused and frightened by a wrongness they could not explain. Pack guards forgot their own rank, fumbling through drills they had performed 1,000 times before. In the Vale family estate, Lady Cressida wandered into the portrait gallery that had always been her sanctuary, rows of Alpha ancestors gazing down from gilded frames. She had known every one of those names since childhood, every marriage, every bloodline, every inherited title. For 3 full minutes, she stood beneath the paintings and could not remember which portrait was supposed to be hers. For 3 minutes, Cressida Vale stood in a room full of portraits and could not remember which one belonged to her. The fear that gripped her in those minutes was unlike anything her position had ever prepared her for. When Nova was told what had happened, she felt no satisfaction, only a tired kind of sorrow. "This is only an echo," she said quietly. "The people erased for real did not forget for 3 minutes. They were forgotten forever." Darius, shaken by what his mother had described, ordered a full registry audit that same night. The results made his stomach turn. Noble bloodlines were tracked back 7 flawless generations. Every marriage, every child, every branch of the family tree accounted for in exact detail. The homeless population living beneath his own central station was listed under a single line, unverified population estimate. Not names, not people, an estimate. His city could trace the bloodline of a noble pup back 7 generations. It could not name the children sleeping under its central station. For the first time, Darius understood that his registry was not missing information. It was missing honesty. That same night, while the city trembled with borrowed grief, Nova had a dream sharper and more urgent than any before it. A small boy's name surfaced through the haze, clear and desperate. Leo Fern, 5 years old, torn from his mother during a shelter raid weeks earlier. Attached to the name was an image, small and specific, a blue plastic dinosaur clutched tightly in a child's fist. But when Nova reached for the name to understand it fully, she felt something else attached to it, a thread leading directly into the burned registry chain connected to Elena Vale. If she returned Lio's name, that chain would begin to unravel, and unraveling it meant risking the last fragile threads of her own identity. She could already feel her own name thinning at the edges, growing fainter each time she carried someone else's weight. Afraid of becoming nameless herself, Nova made a choice she would regret for the rest of her life. She said nothing, she hid the name. While she hesitated, Silas ordered an emergency sweep of Central Station, using the citywide panic as justification. Security swept through the tunnels that same night, and Leo Fern, unable to produce any papers, was taken and logged as an unverified minor. Somewhere in the chaos, the connection between Milo and the burned registry chain destabilized, and for several agonizing hours, Milo's own record flickered out of the pack memory entirely, as though he too had never existed. Darius, terrified and furious, accused Nova of manipulating his son to gain leverage over him. It was Mara Fern, Leo's mother, who finally forced Nova to face what she had done. She found Nova near the tunnels, her eyes hollow with a grief only a parent could carry. Nova could not meet her gaze. I hid his name because I was afraid there would be nothing left of mine. The confession cracked something open inside her chest, ugly and necessary. Mara's voice, when it came, was quiet, and somehow that made it worse. They took my child's name. You were the first person who heard it, and you kept it where I could not reach him. Nova had spent her whole life believing that holding on to names alone was an act of love. In that moment, she understood that keeping a name locked inside herself, unshared and unspoken, could be its own quiet form of erasure. Something in her had to change, or she would become no better than the system she despised. Darius went to the shelters himself 2 nights later, without security detail, without cameras, without council members trailing behind him to manage the optics. Nova led him through the tunnels beneath the station, past children sleeping under thin thermal blankets, past mothers who kept what few papers they had hidden inside their shoes for safekeeping. Old wolves, who no longer remembered their true age, sat near small fires, their names written in pencil on the tunnel walls because no digital system had ever bothered to hold them. Families avoided the free clinics entirely, terrified that a single visit might trigger another registry sweep. Tessa Reed, a sharp-eyed teenage wolf who had appointed herself protector of the younger children, stepped directly into Darius's path without a trace of fear. Your city calls us unverified. Her voice did not shake, but it verified every rent debt we ever owed. Darius said nothing in response, because there was nothing he could say that would not sound hollow. He did not issue commands. He did not silence her with rank. He listened. An old man named Ben Calder, once a registry clerk himself decades ago, handed Darius a list of children who had been taken during recent sweeps, their names scrawled by hand because no official document existed to hold them. Darius recognized his own signature at the bottom of the order that had made those sweeps possible. The pain that settled into him was not the pain of being deceived. It was the pain of realizing he had built a system that trusted paper more than it trusted people. Silas moved quickly to turn the citywide panic to his advantage, calling an emergency vote on something he named the Permanent Verification Act. He argued calmly and persuasively that the unverified population was directly responsible for the destabilization spreading through the Pact's collective memory. The act, if passed, would permanently delete unverified names from every system, authorize the detention of nameless minors, block any cursed testimony from being used in legal proceedings, and grant Silas's office almost unchecked authority over identity itself. Standing before the council, Silas referred to Leo Fern by number instead of name. Mara screamed her son's name across the chamber, desperate for someone to listen. Silas's response was ice, delivered without a flicker of hesitation. A child without papers is not missing. He is unassigned. Nova felt something in her chest come close to breaking entirely. Silas turned toward her next, his composure never wavering. Mercy makes messy records, Miss Gray, and messy records make dead cities. Darius rose from his seat, ready to use his authority as Alpha to halt the vote by force. Nova stopped him with a single look. If he silenced Silas through raw command, the system underneath would remain exactly the same, still dependent on the will of one man at the top. They needed something stronger than a command. They needed proof that could not be denied, held not by one cursed girl alone, but by many hands at once. In the days that followed, Nova began building something she called the returned name chain, a structure meant to carry the weight of restoration together instead of alone. Each name required more than her dream and her memory. It required a living witness to hold the truth alongside her, a family member to carry the physical memory of the person, an old paper trail wherever one still existed, a record of the sweep that had taken them. Mara held on to the small blue dinosaur that had belonged to her son. Tessa brought forward the shelter ledger she had kept hidden for years. Officer Cale Rook, who had once carried out sweeps himself before his own sister was erased over unpaid housing debt, handed over the sweep logs he had quietly preserved. Old Ben brought microfilm salvaged from the fire that had destroyed the original registry records. Darius placed his own signed order into the chain without being asked, a silent admission that his authority was part of what had caused the damage. Milo, still healing his voice, one fragile word at a time, held the lullaby fragment that connected him to his mother. A name carried by one cursed girl could be dismissed as madness. A name carried by witnesses became a person the city could not delete. Nova began the chain with Leo Fern, determined to repair the harm her silence had caused before anything else could move forward. As the chain grew stronger, it pulled loose threads from the burned registry fire that had taken Elena Vale 3 years earlier. What surfaced was not the story Darius had spent 3 years believing. Elena had not died because of registry chaos or rogue infiltration. She had discovered that Silas was quietly selling the identity data of homeless children to private security contractors, treating vulnerable lives as inventory to be traded. When Elena tried to copy the evidence and remove it from the registry, Silas altered the official records to frame her as a traitor, then set the fire to destroy any remaining proof. A fragment of her name had fallen into the space where Nova's curse lived, unclaimed and unresolved for 3 long years. That was why Milo had recognized something in Nova the very first night, Not her face, not her blood, but the echo of a lullaby the registry had never fully managed to erase. Nova was not his mother. She was the last person still carrying a piece of the truth his mother had died trying to protect. Milo found his voice again in that moment, small but clear. She was not gone. You stopped saying her name. Darius could no longer explain away what he had allowed to happen under his own rule. Silas prepared to execute a final registry purge, timed to erase every unverified name in the city before anyone could stop him. Nova understood that stopping the purge meant opening both Leo's name and Elena's burned chain at the exact same moment, an act that would cost her more than she had ever paid before. She could feel her own name, Nova Gray, already growing thin and uncertain in her mind. Darius offered to lock down the system using his Alpha authority, desperate to protect her from the cost. Nova refused. An Alpha's command could pause a system. It could not restore what had been taken from the people who had already suffered through it. That could only be done by witnesses, together, choosing to remember out loud. Darius asked her, quietly, which name she would choose to return first. I choose to return the first name I was afraid to lose. She meant Lio. The final hearing convened inside the registry tower beneath massive screens, counting down toward the permanent verification act. Names across the unverified population began flashing into blank, unreadable code. Nova walked in, carrying the returned name chain, flanked by everyone who had helped build it. Silas smiled coldly, reminding the room that Nova herself held no legal identity at all, then moved to erase her from the system entirely, replacing her name with nothing. Nova felt herself slipping. The name Nova Gray thinned in her mind until it felt less like a name and more like chalk left in rain. For one breath, Nova looked at her own hands and could not remember which one she used to write with. She could no longer recall the sound of her own voice speaking her own name, could no longer picture her own reflection clearly. Thousands of dream names pressed against her mind at once, desperate and overlapping. Milo took her hand and began to hum, soft and steady, the lullaby fragment he had carried for so long. One by one, the chain spoke. Mara said her son's name aloud, clear and unbroken. Tessa read from the shelter ledger she had protected for years. Officer Kale read the sweep logs he had never destroyed. Old Ben projected the salvaged microfilm across the chamber screens. Darius stood and read his own signed order aloud for everyone to hear. A city cannot protect names it cannot verify. Then he added the words that mattered more. I did not erase those names with my own hand, but I signed the silence that let it happen. Nova returned Leo's name to the system, and instantly his file reappeared, whole and undeniable. Mara sank to her knees, finally able to see where her son had been taken. Around the chamber, shelter children began appearing on the screens by name instead of number. Silas lunged toward the console, attempting to delete Elena's file before the truth could fully surface. Milo's voice cut through the chaos, steady and sure. She was not gone. You stopped saying her name. Nova opened the burn chain fully, and Elena's records unfolded across every screen in the tower, exposing the data sales, the falsified trader record, the deliberate sweeps, the fire meant to bury it all. Silas was defeated not by an Alpha's roar or brute force, but by names, witnesses, records, and the memory of a child who had refused to let his mother disappear. Nova stood at the edge of losing herself completely, but the chain held. Darius did not claim her. He did not call her his mate in front of the room, did not declare her his Luna to save her. Instead, he turned to everyone gathered and asked a simple question. Tessa answered first. Mara answered next. Milo said it clearest of all, Nova Gray. Voice after voice repeated it back to her, each one anchoring her more firmly to herself. For the first time in her life, Nova was not the only person holding her own name, and because of that, she did not disappear. Silas was arrested that night. But Darius refused to let the story end there, refused to let one man carry the blame for a system he himself had built and signed into existence. He stood before the registry tower the following morning without a throne, without prepared remarks, without a single clean screen behind him. I did not erase those names with my own hand, but I signed the silence that let it happen. He suspended the Clean Name Initiative immediately and withdrew the Permanent Verification Act entirely. He opened a full investigation into the registry fire and ordered Silas to face an open-pack trial rather than a quiet, private punishment. He restored school access, medical care, and housing eligibility to every child previously marked unverified. Every case listed as unknown, unassigned, or unverified would be reviewed by hand, one by one, and publicly. In front of the entire city, he spoke his mate's true name, refusing to let her be remembered as anything other than what she truly was. Lady Cressida stood at the back of the crowd as Elena's name was read aloud. She did not argue. She did not object. After 3 minutes spent unable to recognize her own portrait, her silence no longer came from pride. It came from something closer to understanding. Milo reached for his father's hand as the crowd began to disperse, small fingers wrapping around larger ones. It was not a grand gesture, but it was the beginning of something neither of them had believed possible 3 years earlier. Weeks later, Darius signed what became known across the city as the Name Restoration Charter. No child could be listed as unassigned once a living witness spoke their name. Homeless wolves would be recorded as individuals, never again reduced to an estimate. Any deletion from the registry would require independent public review. Family testimony could never again be erased through so-called memory correction. Shelters would keep independent paper ledgers that no digital system could quietly overwrite. Cursed testimony alone could not restore an identity, but it could never again be dismissed alone either. No child could be denied school, medical care, or emergency shelter over missing paperwork. Every burned or sealed record would be given a real path toward restoration. Registry officers were required to accept object memory and witness testimony as valid evidence. Any alpha order affecting a person's identity would require civilian review before taking effect. No body could be marked unknown if even one witness was willing to speak a name over it, and the line that mattered most of all was carved above the tower entrance itself. No wolf shall become less real because the city lost, sold, or burned the paper that carried their name. Nova was named Keeper of Returned Names, not because Darius had chosen her as his Luna, and not because his son called her Mom. She was chosen because the city needed someone who would never let it forget what it had erased. Sometime after the chaos had settled, Darius found Nova alone in the old registry archive, the room quiet and unwatched, no council members, no cameras, no expectations pressing in from every side. The bond between them was still there, warm and undeniable, and more than a little frightening in how steady it remained. Nova had already lost so many names, so many pieces of herself, that she was terrified of losing the last of it to a new title she had never asked for. Darius did not reach for her. He did not call her his mate, did not claim her in front of anyone, did not tell her where she belonged. Instead, he asked her something no one had ever thought to ask. What was your name before the city made you carry everyone else's? Nova did not have an answer, not yet, and for the first time that felt like something she was allowed to admit out loud. Darius simply nodded, unbothered by her silence. then we find it only if you want to. It was not a rescue. It was a choice offered freely with no strings attached to it. A month later, Central Station looked different in ways that mattered far more than fresh paint or new lighting. Where security checkpoints once stood, a small station now sat near the east entrance, unguarded and unarmed, meant only to help people find their way back into a system that had once tried to erase them. Nova sat behind the desk, without a crown, without a formal gown, wearing the same worn coat she always had. Tessa kept the shelter ledger close beside her, exactly as she had during the chain. Old Ben brought in microfilm whenever a new case needed tracing. Officer KL logged corrections instead of sweeps now, his uniform the same but his purpose entirely changed. Milo arrived with his father that afternoon, holding the small blue dinosaur that had once belonged to a boy who had been taken from his mother. He returned it himself, placing it carefully into Lyo's hands while Mara watched with tears she no longer tried to hide. Somewhere deep inside her, Nova felt one more dream name loosen and drift away, not vanishing completely, only settling lighter than before. Lady Cressida passed by the newly built name wall on her way through the station, pausing in front of Elena's name, etched clearly into the stone. She said nothing, but this time, she did not turn away either. Darius did not walk ahead of Nova the way he once might have. He stood quietly behind the desk beside her, learning, slowly, how to listen instead of command. A young girl approached the desk hesitantly, no papers in hand, no family standing beside her. An old guard instinctively reached for a form, ready to ask for identification the way the city always had before. Nova lifted her head and stopped him with a glance. She did not ask for proof. She did not ask about pack, bloodline, or rank. She asked the only question that had ever truly mattered. Name? The girl whispered it, barely audible, as though she had never expected anyone to want to hear it. This time, the city wrote it down. The city had once asked for papers before names. Now, under Nova's watch, the first question was not proof, rank, or bloodline. It was the name someone had been waiting to hear. And for the first time since her mother disappeared from the world, Nova felt a name return, without taking another piece of herself away.